Welcome to Professor Skye's Record Review, the only always positive new music review show hosted by a French professor in front of a plant whose name he should really know by now. I'm going to be reviewing the album Hate for Sale by Pretenders, and I'm going to frame it this way. What is my problem with the Pretenders? And right up front, I'm going to give you the answer. My problem with the Pretenders is me. It's no problem with them. It's actually one of my favorite topics to discuss here, the deep-seated, unconscious misogyny of being a pop music fan. In my mind, there's been a whole series of things going on in the background, a bunch of sexist, misogynist beliefs that have been acting on my ears, on my heart, on my mind, without me even knowing. Especially without me knowing. Whenever I'm aware, I can combat them, right? So it's easy to say, oh, well, that's sexism and that's sexism. But my general indifference towards a late 70s, early 80s new wave / post-punk band certainly doesn't fit in the same category as, wage inequality. But I would argue that in a way it does. There's a whole constellation of rock bands with female leads, or new wave bands with female leads, or bands that just came out in the late 70s and 80s, or 70s and 80s, that I have just dismissed. And upon further reflection, the reason why I dismissed them is because they had a female lead singer. We're talking Pretenders, Blondie, Fleetwood Mac. I just sort of assumed, unconsciously, not consciously, I would never go on a message board and be like, these acts are only put forward because there's a woman up front and it's tokenism and all this. I never would have ever said that out loud. But the terrible truth is that in my past, that must have been what was acting in the back of my head. So, that's my question. What's my problem with the Pretenders? I gave The Jam a chance, and I have like 4 Jam albums. And why did I give them a chance? Well, because I took them seriously. I didn't immediately discount them unknowingly because they were fronted by a woman. I'd like to enlarge this argument and actually say that for people of my generation and previous generations, the bias against female rock and rollers is pretty serious. If I think about classic rock radio growing up, there were no women acts played ever. WBCN in Boston, never. Never. Okay, one exception was Heart. Crazy on You! That would get played once a day. Barracuda, once a day. But beyond that, nothing else played. Sure, they would even go into acts, they'd go into the Cars and they'd go into some rock-related new wave music that wasn't just strictly classic rock from the 60s and 70s, but you never heard Pretenders. I would argue this all part of this larger theme, this sort of inherent belief that women are not rock and rollers. So part of what I want to do today is address that, put that out there. If you agree with me, please tell me. If you disagree with me, also please tell me as well, okay? Because I think this is an important thing because these kinds of biases, the unchecked biases, are the most insidious and the ones that hurt society the most. It turns out Pretenders are from Akron, which is bizarre because I am a big fan of 2 Cleveland-era, late 70s, early 80s bands. Devo, apparently Chrissy Hynde was in a band with Mark Mothersbaugh at one point, and Pere Ubu, who I mentioned on my last video, twice in 2 videos. Pretty amazing that Ohio was this beginning, this flourishing of amazing post-punk music. Now you'll see I've been waving this around. I've been talking a big game about how I don't care about the Pretenders. I did buy this CD. I bought it maybe a decade ago. This is one of those CDs that's always in the $8 bin, Like, not $12, that would have been too much, but $8 I would. I gave it a listen, I liked it. I liked it a bunch. And then I just stopped. I didn't pursue Pretenders 2, I didn't pursue any of their other music. I do have a bias against post-punk artists of the late 70s who go into the early 80s. I feel like they had a much shorter window of good stuff. Once the drum machines and synthesizers started to take over, I think there's a shorter window of quality music. But I don't know. This could just be because I listened to Sandinista by The Clash and thought it was garbage. And I listened to Combat Rock and I said, this isn't London Calling, and I thought it was garbage. Maybe the Pretenders released other good music. I don't know. I'm going to be doing a review of an album by a huge rock band in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And all that I know about them is this album and the album that they just released, Pretenders, Hate for Sale. So maybe that'll be interesting. You know, part of this channel isn't, I'm a professor, I am a professor, but this channel is actually about me learning and sharing that learning process with you, more than it is about me teaching you things that I already know. That's why I basically listen to only new music. So let's get into it, right? Let's get into Pretenders. One thing you'll notice, these four people are not these four people. Two of them died, like immediately in my 5 minutes of research. I discovered that these two guys died. So this album just has the two in the middle there. Can you tell which one's the lead singer and which one's the drummer? So the drummer, who I guess has been in and out of the band, and Chrissie Hynde. And it's interesting, right? It's interesting, it's fun because I re-listened to Pretenders and I listened to this, and I would say that for an aging rock band, right? A rock band that is past its prime of relevancy, and that includes, The Who and Bob Dylan and all those, older acts. This is an amazingly consistent album in terms of its feel and its resonance with what they made 40 years ago. I don't actually feel like there's a great dip. I don't feel like there's a great chasm in quality between the two things, which I think is quite strong. The whole thing is led entirely by Chrissie Hynde's voice and her vision. Her voice, this great untrained voice that is capable of emotional rawness in particular. It's capable of communicating real emotion, but also there's a lot of talent in there as well. Like there's one song, Can't Hurt a Fool, she gets these really high notes. But in general, I would say that she has a singing style that is truly post-punk. Like, I don't know why I'm talking about post-punk now. My last review is Proto-Martyr, now I'm talking about Pretenders. But that kind of feeling of a lead singer who's charismatic and draws you in, but it's not with a virtuosity. It's with how close they are to virtuosity, but not quite there. There's a realness and a rawness that isn't the same thing as punk, but it's so close. It's right in between those two worlds of just completely raw and totally polished, which is part of what makes her voice so fascinating. And her voice, not to my ears, a complete Pretenders poser. To my ears, there is no difference between this Chrissie Hynde and the Chrissie Hynde that's on this album. I don't hear backing sounds to try to make it sound stronger. I don't hear forced duets to make it sound stronger. I don't hear chorus. I don't hear reverb. I don't hear auto-tune. I hear Chrissie Hynde like she was in 1980 singing just as strongly. It is really quite impressive. I mean, we look at the artists of that age and they all end up compensating. They all end up changing. They all end up doing something where she sounds basically exactly the same. As far as her voice, we're set. For her vision, the album is quite consistent in its themes. I think it's the wisdom of age is actually the theme here. But it's almost like it's the soundtrack to a kind of broken life. So she's not a complete mess and totally depressed, but there's a lot of wisdom on this album. The wisdom of age, the wisdom of somebody who's been through a lot of relationships that haven't worked out for a number of reasons. Someone who's lived through a lot of loss, right? I mean, if Robert Plant had Jimmy Page and John Entwistle die before Led Zeppelin 3, that's a lot of loss, right? So it's an interesting album about like disappointment and frustration with the banality of existence. It's pretty solid theme. This whole week has been about that. The music, one thing I really appreciate is that they stayed with the 4-person format. And by the way, I'm pretty sure this guy is trying to make the same face. Do you see his face right there? The drummer right there, do you see that? Do you see how he's making that face? I think he's trying to make this same face. I think he's imitating it. I don't know. But it's cool that they stayed with the 4-person format. And this is the thing. Successful rock acts inherently get indulgent. They inherently start bringing in string sections or lute players or harpists or saxophones or whatever it is because they get more money, they get more artistic freedom, and they just get bloated. There's no bloat on this album. This is 4 people making rock and roll music. There's nothing even particularly 2020 about this album. There's no, to my ear, no synthetic elements of this album. There's no computer interaction. But it doesn't feel like it's trying to be a roots album, like this is how we used to make it. It truly feels like Chrissie Hynde has this vision. She likes making these kinds of rock and roll songs, and she makes them, and they're good. They're good, solid rock songs. You might hear a note of criticism in there in the usage of the word solid. To my ear, they're solid, but they aren't divine. So at no point that I hear this do I go, oh my God, this is the truth of existence. But I do hear a lot of very, very solid quality music, which at its worst is a little bit bland. The whole thing is produced by Stephen Street, who produced the Smiths' last album. I meant to put the poster back there. I have the poster, it doesn't matter. And also produced a lot of Blur. I have a lot of ambiguous feelings about Blur, but there you go. The main songwriter on here, interestingly, is not some old fuddy-duddy who she worked with when she lived in London in the 70s. It's some guy who apparently was born in 1980, who was born the same year that the drummer on this album decided to make that face. Way to go, Martin Chambers. So it's interesting. A very good songwriter, very solid again. I could have perhaps gone with a little bit more experimentation, but that's not where we are. That's not what Chrissie Hynde is trying to do with the Pretenders, or Pretenders. It's not the Pretenders, right? There's no article. It's just Pretenders, which also is just a great name. Just pretending is an interesting theme. So I'll kind of go track by track. I will play you a little bit in a second. It opens up with a track called Hate for Sale. That's very clearly, I think it's political, but it's also just this general concept of the nature of existence and humanity and the banality of human beings and the way that we just kind of keep buying and selling hatred. Her voice is just so strong. You know, when you think about any of the great heroes of the 70s and 80s, and you just think about what's happened to their voice, you know, I mean, Iggy Pop. I mean, I love Iggy Pop, but you listen to it and you hear an old man. You listen to Chrissie Hynde and you just hear Chrissie Hynde. It's interesting. The voice is insanely high in the mix for basically this whole album. Like, I felt like when Stephen Street was producing it, he was just like he also produced some of Morrissey's albums. I get the sense he just had the same settings, you know, just super big singer settings, and just had it up to 11 and had the rest of the band at 5. There's some regrettable harmonica here. That is a sort of lead singer problem. It's like, just because you can play harmonica doesn't mean you should. Next track is The Buzz, a little bit more nuanced, less of a rocker, kind of Brit poppy, a nice lead guitar line, has some vulnerability in the lyrics. This is almost like it would be a good soundtrack to a cheesy movie about an older couple falling in love, because it's all about love and feeling the buzz. Then we get to the track Lightning Man, which switches things up and becomes kind of like a reggae track, but in this very British style. Reminds me a little bit of Gorillaz even, in that kind of area of like faux reggae. I sort of wonder if this isn't just on here that some bands just like play with genres just to like fill out the album and add some dynamics to it. You're like, let's just do a blues number, let's just do a reggae number. But when I listened to it again, I listened to it a second time, and it's actually a really, like, if this song were sung by a Jamaican and the band were not as clean, and if the sound were a little bit dirtier, this would be a beautifully awesome, slightly dubbish reggae song. So maybe its only real flaw is that I don't associate reggae with clean instrumentations or white female vocalists. I don't know. So it's actually quite a good song, but I didn't enjoy listening to it. Next track, Turf Accountant Daddy, almost rockabilly on this one. But it's sort of about just sort of a boring person who tries to be interesting. The things that you've become, or the things that you were afraid of. It has kind of a keyboard solo, which is kind of nice. The next track is one of the ballads on the album, and where she gets, I'm not going to say campy, but maudlin. It's called You Can't Hurt a Fool. And it's very strong singing, very ambitious. And the lyrics and the songwriting and the phrasing, I thought they were kind of jazz-like, but actually they do remind me a lot of Morrissey, now that I think about it. Or just any of the sort of singers who are rock or post-punk or all that stuff, but in reality, kind of deep down, just sort of want to be crooners. This is like a great crooner song. But once again, do we allow women to be crooners? Not really. So, But that's a really nice song. I would say to get a good sense of the sort of dynamics of the album, listen to the first track and then listen to You Can't Hurt a Fool to hear the sort of softer and harder side. I Didn't Know When to Stop is kind of a simpler punk style song, great guitar solo, a good usage of harmonica, and this is just one of the great songs on this album about the wisdom that comes from a failed relationship. Maybe Love Is in New York City. I don't know, I'm so sick of songs about New York City, songs that personify New York City. I'm just not even gonna. Can't you sing about Akron? Akron's way more interesting. Then we get to The Stamp, Junkie Walk. And this is just a very simple song. I imagine that she wrote it in half an hour. It's a sad, weary song about the nature of dealing with junkies and the way that they talk and lie and the way they die. So what I'm going to play it for you here. I'm going to play you 14 seconds of it. Try to avoid the copyright goblins. And what I want you to listen to is just the straightforward rockingness of it, the interesting tone of her voice, the straightforwardness of her voice, and just the successful continuation of Pretender's aesthetic. So I think that gives you an idea of it. That's a really nice, catchy song. Then Didn't Want to Be This Lonely is almost like a I want candy, kind of like that rhythm. An Aiko rhythm, a Faith. It almost sounds like Faith by Michael Jackson, by George Michael Jackson. Very troubled monster I created in the basement, George Michael Jackson. Boy George Michael Jackson Brown. Boy George Michael Jackson Brown is in my basement. He's a rock pop monster I created. Jesus Christ. I'm not even that tired, but this is a really fun idea. Boy George Michael Jackson Brown. Okay. I Didn't Want to Be This Lonely is really nice because it's kind of a pair with I Didn't Know When to Stop, that she's just saying that, you know, she's fighting for her independence, and often when you get out of relationships, you know, like you're just trying to be independent, trying to be yourself, you get out of something toxic and here you are. But then you're like, I didn't want to be this lonely. You know, she's really expressing that sort of, that feeling that I wanted to be lonely and I wanted to be on my own, but I didn't want to be this lonely. And then the whole album ends with a completely bonkers track. I said that I wish this album were a little bit more avant-garde. It delivered with this last track, Crying in Public. It's a ballad, it's a little bit cheesy, but it goes so far. She gets so lost in the vulnerability of this concept of crying in public that she abandons rhymes for most of it. The desperation in her voice echoes the desperation of the song and just talks about the feeling of crying in public. I really appreciate this song. I really appreciate that we have an album that can rock like this, but at the same time can bring up a point. Now, however, caveat here, in the middle, at the end of the song, she says, I know feminists say there's no difference, but I know feminists say that we're the same in every way, but I've never seen a man cry this way, something like that, implying that men don't cry in public. I can tell you as a man who has cried in public many times, including one time on an elliptical at the gym while listening to a song about friendship. That was during the divorce, dark times. But still, I think her point is interesting. That lyric is very problematic and difficult as a feminist, because I'm like, that's not the point of feminism. Isn't that women don't ever experience anything different, but the whole idea behind this song that's trying to speak to a specific feeling, a specific hurt, that she makes a specific hurt for women, which we don't need to argue whether or not that's true. She even then ends it by saying it doesn't matter how rich you are, how poor you are. There's a kind of universal understanding, and in her mind it's between women, in my mind it's between all human beings, that we've all cried in public. And that crying in public has strength and meaning to it that needs to be put in a song and expressed really well. And she did. They did. So there's my review of Pretenders. 40 years later, I like it just as much as the first album. It doesn't quite do that thing for me that makes me love it and want to play it all the time, but I'm very happy to have listened to it, and I am going to pay more attention and probably buy Pretenders 2 at least. Okay, tell me what else to buy if you're a big Pretenders fan. And until tomorrow, for the Porgs, there's the camera.